and welcome to ShakeTube episode 8. So we previously looked at Richard III, which has been one of my favorite plays of ShakeTube so far, and so I was curious as to how I would really feel about this week's play, Richard II. What's interesting is though the events of this play actually take place before Richard III, which was written in about 1592, this was written afterward in about 1595 and was the first play of his second tetralogy, which is a series of 4 plays, whereas Richard III was actually the last play of his first tetralogy. Whew, that's pretty confusing. The first big difference for me was more of a grounding in reality, at least character-wise. When you had Richard III, he was kind of a caricature of evil, and he had these big monologues talking to the audience to let them in on this plot that he has to take the throne. But when you get to this play, a lot of the characters are more balanced out overall, and the play just practices more subtlety. I liked getting thrown into the action right away at the king's court. It really just brought me into the play a lot faster than some of the other plays. I think some of Shakespeare's other works take some time to get rolling and can make the reading just a bit more difficult because I'm not invested in the characters yet, but here you had accusations flying back and forth as to who killed the Duke of Gloucester, and it was just a great scene to really set things off. You have Richard II sitting on his throne, really portraying the fact that he is an all-powerful king, and it was a great way to start his downward progression. One of the big aspects of the play that makes it so unique is its look at what it means to be king, and it looks at that from a bunch of different perspectives. And so in the second scene, you have a bit more of a subdued setting with John of Gaunt, and he reveals that he does believe that Richard II was the one that carried out this murder of the Duke of Gloucester, but he only thinks that divine intervention can really do anything about it because he believes that the king is chosen by God, and so only God can take the king off the throne. And that's really interesting because you have these kings all throughout history that have some really questionable morals, and so people seemed to know that, but they didn't always think that they could do something about it. So that was a fascinating perspective here at the beginning. You also get a look into the thoughts of the king himself, which is pretty unique because a lot of times you're waiting until the end for a certain character to get the crown, and then it kind of ends from there. But here, as the king loses the crown, you get to see that being king was such a central part of his identity that once he loses the crown, he doesn't really know what to do with himself because it is so internalized that he is this royal figure and is somebody that has the backing of a deity, that once he isn't that, how can he even go on? I thought that that was really fascinating, and I loved having that perspective in this play. The simultaneous fall of Richard and rise of Henry was really well done. The seeds were planted really early on for Richard being a bad king. Of course, there is the murder, that's not great, but then you also have his decisions where he only partially banishes Henry after all of these accusations are flying around at the beginning, but then he fully banishes Thomas Mowbray, which that doesn't really make sense. He doesn't have a reason for doing that, and usually when you are a leader, you want to have just the ability to make good decisions, and here he just didn't have any evidence as to why he chose to do that, and he even shortened the exile of Henry because of John's tears, and it just seemed like he didn't have quite the grasp of the gravity of that situation. And then you have later on when Henry is still banished and John dies, the king actually goes in and just steals all of the property of John, which should go to Henry as far as inheritance goes. And that's just such a bad move because he knows Henry is coming back at some point, and once John is gone, and if Richard doesn't have a successor, Henry's going to be the next in line to be the king. And so for him to make that decision without really thinking it through, it just shows that, again, he's not a great decision maker and is probably a pretty poor king. And by the way, that scene was amazing when John was dying and he asks to speak to the king. He finally feels empowered to really let loose his true thoughts. And I thought that that was also amazing because you don't get to see that all the time either. Everybody has to respect the king, but here, when Jon is going to experience the freedom of death, he has the freedom of speech at the same time, and he really lets loose, and I thought that that scene was excellent. And so getting back into the succession of the crown here, let's just look at the politics again. I kind of did this in the Richard III video, but I don't know how much of a role this played in Shakespeare's writing, but when you look at the lineage of the king, you start to see that there could be some reasons as to why he wrote certain characters certain ways. So let's dive into that. Richard II kind of has his own story here. He was the son of Edward the Black Prince, who died 1 year before his father, Edward III, leading the crown to fall to Richard II, who was actually a minor at the time, in 1376. Obviously, next you have Henry IV, who was a descendant of House Lancaster, who paired with House of Tudor in the Wars of the Roses from 1455 to 1487. And so this play here was actually the final years of Richard II's life. And so that was the time period of around 1398 to about 1400, because Richard was actually dethroned in 1399. So he was a descendant of John of Gaunt, and so that's really important because it's setting up the events for the Wars of the Roses later on. Henry V is the next in line, both for the crown and for our reading, so I don't know that much about him, and I will be excited to explore a little bit more into his life during the next video, but he was the next descendant, and then when he dies, Richard VI takes over at 9 months old, and then he ends up being mentally unstable, and he passes away, and that's the end of the Gaunt/Lancaster line, and so his death is what's taking place at the beginning of the play, Richard III. The crown then goes to Edward IV, who was a distant relative of the Duke of York, who was actually on the side of Henry IV at the end of this play, but that's really interesting because that is the House of Lancaster, but the Duke of York actually splits off and fights on the opposite side of the Wars of the Roses, so something must have happened in the middle there. But I don't actually know what that is yet, because I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I'm definitely learning each week. But regardless, it gets to Richard III through those means, and that eventually ends up with the Tudor reign, which is the house that's in power at the time Shakespeare writes this play. Whoa. So, would that really affect Shakespeare's writing that far removed? Richard II isn't technically a part of either side of the Wars of the Roses, but as we saw with Richard III, it really did play a role in him writing Richard III as this really evil guy, because all of history was kind of changed to portray the House of York as being just kind of the bad side of history, because of course the loser's always the bad side. But here you have Henry IV, which is a descendant of the House of Lancaster, and they are the ones that paired up with the House of Tudor, so maybe that is why Henry IV seems to be more of a good character in this play. I don't know for sure, but I do think that that could partially be a factor in Shakespeare's writing and is worth pointing out. And so I did finish this play pretty close to the deadline here, and I didn't get to look at it too much more than that, but overall I did enjoy the story quite a bit. I thought this was an excellent play, and I'm really glad that we got a chance to see the opposite end of that timeline that we ended with Richard III, and so it'll be really cool to see how that continues with Henry V next week. So that's all I have for this week. Next week is looking like it's going to be really busy for me on the BookTube front. I've been organizing another read-along that looks at the works of Edgar Allan Poe, and I said that that next video is going to be on October 20th, and turns out that's a Friday, so you're going to see both Edgar Allan Poe videos next Friday, as well as another ShakeTube video, so you'll be seeing a lot of me, and I hope I'll be seeing a lot of you as well. Thanks for participating as always. See you next week.